When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. In this episode, we're very excited to have our good friend, Leslie Ross-Degnan, back to talk about this episode of a book review. And Leslie is a published poet and an educator and a good friend. So welcome, Gregg. It's good to see you again. And welcome, Leslie. It's great to have you here.
Good to be here, Janet and Gregg, again, to talk about a book. It's a good summer thing to do. And the book that we're reading, Still Life with Breadcrumbs by Quindlen, is a good choice for a summer book. I mean, it's not too long, not too heavy, and it has something in it really for everyone. And it's full of oldish themes for us to discuss. So let me just talk a little bit about Quindlen. I'd like to start off with some background to the author. She's definitely a prolific writer of both fiction and nonfiction. And she often writes about women's issues, relationships, and the complexities of families. And also just in general, the human condition as we all struggle to cope with unexpected events in our lives. And Still Life's a good example of all of these. And I think there's something in there for not just women, but also for men, everyone in the human race. But Quindlen, just a little bit of information about her. She's just about exactly our age. She was born in 1952. She's 72 years old, and she's still writing. She just published a new novel called After Annie. And once again, it really touches on some of those issues that I just mentioned. After Annie is about grief. And it's about the different ways that all the different characters respond to the loss of this one particular woman in their community, the husband, the children, the community, etc. Her first book, this is interesting with her, Living Out Loud, a nonfiction. It was written in 1988. And her last book, After Annie, a fictional novel, was published in 2024. So that's 22 books in 36 years. A lot of writing. So 3 of her books also, One True Thing and a book called Black and Blue and another one called Blessing, were all made into movies. Black and Blue and Blessings were TV movies, made for TV movies. But One True Thing, and you could watch this on Netflix, was made into a big screen movie starring Meryl Streep, who incidentally was nominated for Best Actress in this film. She didn't win that year, but her performance was pretty amazing. But also besides her, William Hurt was also in this movie, and a young Renee Zellweger, who I think probably should have been nominated for Best Actress. So if you want to see one of her books as a movie, watch it. It's really a good one. I don't want to give you too much information about it because we're not really talking about One True Thing. We're talking about Still Life with Breadcrumbs. A few more things about Quindlen. She also worked as a journalist and a reporter for the New York Post and a columnist for the New York Times, for which she won the Pulitzer in 1992. And this made her the 3rd woman to win the Pulitzer for commentary. But then in 1955, she left journalism altogether to become a full-time novelist. The book we're reading was sometime in the middle of her career that she wrote this. Now, let me just give you a little brief synopsis of Still Life with Breadcrumbs. So in this, her main character is Rebecca Winter. Rebecca's in her late 50s, 60s, and she's a successful photographer in New York City. She's married to a man who's professor at the university and teaches all these art courses and art philosophy courses, and he's very full of himself. And he's also a real philanderer. He has a lot of relationships with his students, the academic type. They had a son together. His name was Ben. One of her photographs taken the morning after a dinner party, her husband used to come home with guests for dinner and never tell her. This is the kind of guy he was. He used to drive her crazy. So one night after he did this, she fell asleep on the couch, woke up in the morning and started taking photographs of the table. An after dinner party table the next morning. We've all experienced what that looks like. On the table, there were dirty wine glasses and plates stacked and forks and baguettes broken in half and half eaten. What Rebecca, the main character, called a vaguely Flemish still life composition. You can kind of picture it. Still Life with Breadcrumbs was named after this photograph, actually. It became a real success. It got these rave reviews, and it grew to symbolize a quote, an elevation and an indictment of women's lives and work. And women read all sorts of messages into this photograph. I'm going to read from the book of some of the things that how this happens when everyone says, this is a wonderful, famous photograph. Everybody reads all kinds of things into it. So one of them was that a feminist posited that the word still was obviously a way of suggesting how empty the existence of the average American woman was. And then that the breadcrumbs were an allusion to Hansel and Gretel, leaving a trail so someone could find you, rescue you, keep you from being eaten alive. I thought these were interesting feminist twists on meaning of this book. And for a long time, this poster was everywhere. It was showing up in windows of framing shops, on the walls of coffee houses, in the offices of nonprofit groups for women, in dorm rooms. It was just everywhere. And women really valued the message here. It was important to them. But then, of course, by the time she was 60, her fame began to wane. She got divorced, and the money that she was earning from her shows of this photograph and other photographs stopped coming in. She had to rent out her expensive New York apartment. She couldn't afford it anymore. And she went to live in this small house in the country. It was sort of a timeout for her to figure out what was next. I think that's not uncommon as we get older. Her son was grown and her parents were in assisted living. She was kind of part of that sandwich generation where she was helping her son financially and emotionally while he figured out his life in college and life after college. And while she was also supplementing the cost of both her parents' living arrangements with her dwindling funds. So now her oldish life story and struggle begins. This is a story that has a familiar ring to many of us. And let's start with the aging parents, caretaking kind of sandwich generation of still caring for your grown children, but also caring for your aging parents. Any comments you guys want to share on that? Or did you notice that? Were you, concerned about that?
I think she did a good job with that because she didn't just say Rebecca's taking care of her aging parents and one's in a memory care facility and the other one lives nearby in assisted living or whatever the situation is. She uses her interactions with them as an opportunity to reflect on her lives with them, how they were as parents, how they influenced her development, and how now that she was older and was all grown up, she could see some of those ways in which they raised her, some of the ways in which they treated her and each other as their quirks as they were older. So she can see them more as humans, I think, than people can see. It's hard to see your parents as human beings. But I think the taking care of them like this gave her an opportunity to really clearly focus on who they were and how they were, and also on the fact that she hadn't fully forgiven them for their quirkiness yet. So as an oldish person living in isolation, she had an opportunity to reflect on that. And there are a couple of scenes where she goes to visit them and we get to see what their lives are like. And I was totally fascinated. It took me to the end of the book to figure out how real this was. but I was totally fascinated by the sign of dementia that the author assigned to Rebecca's mother was that her fingers were constantly playing surfaces, like she was playing a piano, as though she had been a concert pianist. And that, what an interesting little thing to have noticed. She must have noticed it about somebody who just, that was left all of, their ability to communicate. My mother suffered from dementia at the end of her life, and my grandmother did as well. And so I've seen what I think of a lot of that, both in them and in their nursing homes and in other places. And the thing that always struck me the most was the key thing was the lack of the ability to communicate. And I always said to my siblings and to other relatives that my mother was still in them. And I've heard people say about their own relatives who have dementia, well, she doesn't even know us anymore. I was firmly of the opinion, I think I still am, that that's not necessarily the case, but what's missing is the ability to say that or to acknowledge it in any kind of a way, because the means of communication have faded away. And so this piano playing, and Rebecca even talked about how she could judge her mother's mood by what song she appeared to be playing, apparently guessing from the fingerings or whatever. She's playing on the top of a table. She's playing on a book. She's playing on the breakfast tray. Everything is a keyboard to her in her drive to communicate something to somebody. So that to me was really poignant. And Rebecca didn't dismiss her. She didn't, as far as I could tell, make any effort to quantify and translate the piano-ness. And she didn't say what I just said, but it seemed like that was a good picture of that feverish effort to communicate. She described her mother as always playing, just all the time, no matter what, just always playing.
I think she also used that as a way to reflect on some of the neglect that she experienced from her mother as a child. And I think what you said earlier, Greg, is really true, that she was, as an adult, a 60-year-old woman, an older adult. You go back and forgive your parents these things, but you also get more information about why they did it. It's almost like an epiphany in a way. As you get older, looking back on your childhood, you could see it.
Yeah, one of the quotes around there was Rebecca, I think she was describing her mom and saying she is a prisoner in the amber of her own past. And I actually can't remember if Rebecca was saying that about herself or saying that about her mom, but I think Rebecca was trying to break through that sense of being a prisoner in her own life by the whole book, where she's out in a different part of the world, or as far as rural. I just want to say as an aside is that I was a concert pianist, and I know that experience in that from the time I was 7 until I graduated from high school, I basically practiced the piano every day. And as I got older, I was playing the piano every day for an hour. And I found that when I went to bed at night, my fingers would be moving and just playing something. And so my take of that was, and did for many, many, many years after I stopped playing at night, my fingers would be playing. So I took that both as that I'm guessing that Anna Quindlen was a piano player, and that she knew someone in real life, because how would you know that? And secondly, that Rebecca, the character, could recognize what her mother was playing. Like she said, as you were saying, Greg, that she could see, oh, I see my mom's playing the Moonlight Sonata right now. That means she's probably in this kind of mood. So I saw that as a fascinating talking about ways that her mother was existing and what she was bringing into her life at this moment that was such a big part of her life before.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I thought as a reference to how when people age, especially when they have Alzheimer's, my mother died of Alzheimer's, But I have heard this and seen this actually in motion, that music is one of the last memories to go, that people with dementia and Alzheimer's, they still remember how to do that because, like you just said, Janet, it's so ingrained that no matter what your brain's doing, it's so programmed to create music that you do, whether it's vocal or instrumental or whatever it is.
It is interesting to think about being in that sandwiched between your adult children and your aging parents and their needs. My parents died when I was pretty young, so I never had that experience. But as an adoptee, my birth mother is still alive and she's 90, almost 91. And I don't have as much of that care responsibility, but I think emotionally I can relate to what can be stressful or just taking attention, just like my adult children can be taking attention and focus and emotional energy.
And she's aging herself. So she didn't have so much bandwidth, not just aging herself, but in a difficult situation at her age where she sort of lost her job and didn't have the finances to keep paying for her parents' housing, which is what she was doing, and also subsidizing her son. She's leaving, she's retiring, aging out of her job for a variety of reasons. And there's this one place in the book where she won an award to honor the work that she'd done as a photographer. And this award was usually given to aging artists. And though she was one of the youngest to get the award at 60, she really felt older. She felt like her career was over because of her circumstances she was in her life. In the retirement, the downsizing.
Yes. There's a quote on the back cover that says, "A wise tale about second chances, starting over, and going after what is most important in life." And so I feel like this Rebecca character definitely was in the crux of what her life had been and what it was going to be moving forward. And so I love the way Anna Quindlen captured that sense of disequilibrium and kind of fear at times and doubting, um, and then being able to figure it out.
She was good at the internal space that Rebecca lived in, Anna Quindlen was. The book was published in 2014. So Anna Quindlen was 62 then. So she would have been 60 probably when she was writing or framing this book up. So I wonder if there's a way to look at this is her take on her life at that stage. She takes an artist who has had some success and enough success to be making a decent living based on something that she had done really many years ago. And it sounds like from the brief bio of Anna Quindlen that you did there, Leslie, it sounded like there may have been some similarities in there. A Pulitzer Prize winner in her youth, and now what? So metaphorically, and I can't remember whether you pointed out in the synopsis, but what Rebecca has done is rented a ramshackle place in the country, someplace like the Catskills, a couple hours drive from New York, and the ramshackliest place you can think of, raccoons in the attic. A lot of this is just a really good metaphor for stepping out of your daily life at that stage and experiencing there's raccoons in your head. So there are raccoons up in the attic. What the hell was that noise in my head? And it turns out that that's a raccoon in the cottage that she's rented. But I think is a great metaphor for the kinds of things that go through your mind when you reach that oldish precipice, so to speak. I think 60 is about the beginning of oldishness, just in terms of to attach a number to it.
It's a transition from like an old lifestyle to something else, something more modest, something less expensive, because money becomes an issue when you retire and you're on a fixed income. For most people, that's a big issue. So it's not just money and retirement and downsizing. It's like reinventing yourself and often transforming if you need another supply of money or a stream of money coming in or moving to another place. This was a big transition. that a lot of people go through after retirement at 65. She talked about her clothes. I thought that was really interesting. You remember that whole thing about like downsizing, and now I don't have to wear all these clothes that I used to wear to work all the time. And she found herself just like wearing the same thing every day, like, wearing more casual clothes or sweatpants and sweatshirts and t-shirts. And thought that was interesting.
And what's interesting is what popped into my head was when we talked about remnant population and how that main character, her clothing evolution, once she was by herself on this planet and there weren't any other humans around, and that she just stopped wearing clothes. So it's a fascinating symbolism for what worked for us, what we thought we needed, what we did need, we don't need anymore, and coming to that realization.
Also, she was home all day. All of a sudden, she's home all day. I mean, isn't that like a typical retirement thing? You're home, you're no longer working. What are you going to do? She's in a place where she doesn't know anybody. She has to get to know people. And then she did this other interesting thing that I thought was probably not uncommon. She was trying in some way to recreate her routine. And she used to get coffee every morning. So she found this coffee place that was run by this woman, Sarah Ashby, I think her name was. Tea for Two, wasn't that the name of it? A coffee bar, and had all these wonderful croissants. And so that became a routine of hers because it was similar to her routine that she did when she was in the city going to work every day.
Exactly.
And it was nice for her because she and Sarah became friends, even though if you wanted to know anything about anybody or anyone in the village, you go to that Tea for Two and have a chat with Sarah. She was a real kind of chatty, gossipy person. But Sarah also embraced some of the stereotypes that men have of women. Her husband was not a very nice guy, and all he ever did was tease her about how fat she was. My wife is so fat. And I just thought, oh, that's terrible. But she did it in an interesting way that was happening. And that Sarah I don't think she was an obese woman, but she was probably a little on the overweight side, right? And Rebecca's kind of watching this relationship, and I'm not really sure, that's a very good idea. But again, this is how she brought in women's issues, body issues, and other issues through her characters. And she did a really nice job of just bringing that in.
Yeah, it is an interesting kind of for people as we're aging, and our oldish is what of our old life, our former life up to this point, can we shed, including clothes and maybe how we're living, and then what do we need to hold on to? Like one of the things that was in the book, one of the quotes was, she needed to reclaim the basic syntax of her daily existence. And I loved that sentence, but this is like so creative. And I'm thinking about what is the basic syntax of our daily existence. It doesn't necessarily mean certain clothes. It doesn't mean a certain kind of house, but what do each of us need? Getting that coffee to start the day or whatever it might be.
That was a good way to communicate that. I think she had a lot of fears about starting over. We all do. It's like suddenly you're confronted with the unknown. There were a lot of metaphors in this book. And I think one of them was the snowstorm. When she was in the house by herself and the snowstorm came, she felt fearful for the first time being on her own, and also coping with something on her own. Like, what happens if I can't get out of the door? What happens if this doesn't stop? Maybe I need some help, but how am I going to get help? How can I reach out to somebody and ask somebody to help me? And she did actually have help, but just the whole idea of being vulnerable and needing help was kind of new to her. And I think that the snowstorm was kind of a metaphor for that, because you're really shut in then, right? You're like an old shut-in person, and you have to confront those fears.
I think that was a very powerful metaphor, and I felt it as I was reading it. I just felt like, what would you do if you're by yourself, you're new, you don't know anybody, you don't even know how this house works or how to keep yourself warm, and then you don't have any technology working to be able to call somebody or text somebody. I mean, that felt really scary to me reading it.
But then she was rescued by the handsome stranger. somebody came and plowed her driveway and dug out a path to her door. He appeared throughout the book as, I don't know if he was ever described as handsome, but that's how I thought of him, as the handsome stranger, the woodsman showing up at the cottage of the princess in the forest and kind of saving the day to a certain extent.
Yeah, I thought that was going to happen much sooner, actually. Somebody was going to come and help her. But it took a lot of time. It took a few days because something was going on with his sister, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And something was going on. But he did, in the end, come to rescue her. But I saw it more as just part of what his character was. The very first time she met him, he was rescuing her, getting that raccoon out of the attic, right? So that was, to me, like his character. And he was like the guy that helped everybody. Like, I think at one point, the woman in the shop, Sarah, said, "Oh, you'll have to ask Jim about that." He seemed to be that guy, that go-to guy for a lot of people.
When I read that, I didn't think of him as rescuing her per se. I mean, obviously, when he drove in on the snowplow, he was literally rescuing her from being stuck. But I guess I saw it as that she, especially looking back on it, that this was her building her new community, and that she was, for lots of reasons, a little bit hesitant, reticent. So he was almost like the metaphor for, as we're aging, is it okay to reach out? Is it okay to get help? And do you lose your sense of autonomy or your sense of equality? So I think that's why I'm responding to the rescuing piece, because I feel like what she was working on was how to continue to feel independent as much as possible, which I think is a huge oldish theme. How do we feel as independent as possible while we do need different things, more things?
Yeah, we need to ask for help sometimes. And that's what she didn't want to do and had to do. That was not easy. Started to mention the dog earlier because I think the dog was another metaphor. The stray, homeless dog was kind of like a symbol of her own not belonging and her own struggle to regain her independence. This dog was super independent, had been pushed around and abused by this person and that person at a time when she was still trying to figure out how to be on her own. So I kept thinking that was interesting. And when she was stuck in the house in the snowstorm, the dog was in there. She had taken it in at that point, and it was in the house with her. And she was trying to figure out how to let it get outside. So she opened a window and let it out. And that made her kind of vulnerable then to the storm. And I just thought the dog was sort of an interesting symbol of that.
The dog was the smartest person in the book.
Say more about that.
Well, he always had this knowing attitude, and he was pretty tough. He was a stray who had been taken in and taken to a shelter and had ended up in 3 or 4 different places. And the last place that he was at, the woman was going through some issues, and she would sometimes feed him cat food and sometimes forget to feed him altogether and sometimes forget that he was even there. And he had really learned how to take all of this kind of stuff in stride and just take care of himself. And I have this picture of him laying in the living room. I don't think she had a fireplace, but I picture this fireplace. She must have had a wood stove or something. Just laying in front there, keeping warm, and all of these shenanigans and machinations and all the stuff that she's going through and the people that she knows are going through. I just see him looking at this and raising up an eyebrow, and it's like, there you folks go again. And, all you have to do is just go up to somebody's house and they'll give you food. You don't have to go through all of this stuff.
Well, he was certainly the most resilient character in the story, no question about that. But I think resilience is another one of her themes, that people overcome adversity. They overcome these transitions in life, that we all manage to do it, but it helps to have other people in your life to do it with. And she felt real alone when she first went to the country, but then she found friends and she developed a trusting relationship with Jim Bates, her, as you describe him, Greg, her knight in shining armor. But she also developed a nice relationship with other people in the town, Sarah Ashby. And yeah, and I think that this story, because it involves her parents too, her aging parents. I think that this story, as I talked about earlier, that her newest one that she just published in this year in 24, called After Anna, was all about grief. But I think there's a lot of grief in this story too, not in a direct way that your mother and your father die and you're grieving them, but other things in your life die. There's a lot of actual deaths in the story too. Her father dies and her mother's declining. And so she's grieving her father and wondering how she's going to manage with her mother around her father's death. And then the photographs she starts to take again with the cross that are related to Jim Bates' sister. And then the sister dies. I mean, so there's a death theme, but there's also complications around death, grief, just in general, loss. And so just on that same theme, I'm thinking about for her own self personally, she experienced a death of a career and then a kind of a resurrection, that there is life after death, because she gets a new agent through her son's partner and she begins to publish her photographs again. So in a way, she comes full circle in that grief cycle too, where she feels vital again. She feels like, okay, she can come back after a painful detour and learn some lessons about the changes in life or aging gracefully, if there is such a thing. I don't know if there really is such a thing, or what does that mean anyway? But
Yeah, we'll find out.
I think we're finding out. So far, I think we're doing pretty good. But I think that along with it being about grief and the grief cycle and the detour and then coming back, it also feels like this evolving of being oldish. That for her in this story, she was feeling like her work was over, her profession was over. She wasn't getting any business with her photographs. But then to be able to, through all of this, getting a new agent, happening to take photographs of the dog and of the crosses, which was her passion. So she suddenly found herself doing that. And then coming full circle and evolving so that she was able to see, oh, this can still be part of my life, even being a guest lecturer or a teacher in college in the fall. And so it was almost like the wave of time and age pushing her along, but not drowning her. So finding out, okay, I could do this. I could teach for a semester. I have new photographs and I have a new chapter.
She resolved all these conflicts in a way in the end, not completely, but a big movement towards resolution.
Yeah, it seemed like she learned to go with the flow a lot more than she had in the past, which I think is an important component of aging gracefully or being oldish, is the ability to go with the flow rather than try to force things. She wasn't trying to make a living taking pictures of the dog. She just liked to take pictures, and there was a dog. And she was walking in the woods, and there were these strange little totemic scenes that someone had placed in the woods, and she took pictures of them because they were interesting. Her art and her skills came into play in both cases, but she was not thinking, I'll take pictures of these and this will resurrect my career. She was thinking, oh, what a nice thing to take a picture of. And so she took those pictures, and because she had taken those pictures, they resurrected her career. It wasn't like something that she had made. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I need to have a new subject for my pictures. And, oh, here's a good subject. I'll take this, and that'll save the day. She wasn't doing that at all.
Well, it seemed like that's the kind of photographer she was, sort of an opportunistic photographer. That's how her still life with Breadcrumbs became famous. She was just taking pictures of a scene on a table that happened to become interpreted by somebody. And I think maybe that's what her new agent did. Her new agent breathed life into what she was doing again, helped to breathe vision back into her life.
Well, this was a summer book, as you said, a good summer read, as you said, Leslie. I think it's actually a bit more than that. I really enjoyed a lot of her writing and the turns of phrase. And I have a quote that I'll drag out before we're done here today. But because it is a good summer read, it has a good romance in it. Do we want to talk about the romance at all?
Yeah, romance in later life.
That's an interesting facet of oldishness. And I don't know whether it's because we're causing it to happen, but if you go back through our conversationalist list, our guest list for the last couple of years, there's a whole lot of people on there who have discovered romance later in life, in various ways, all the way from Lynn Brown Rosenberg, whose book was My Sexual Awakening at 70, to Joan Price, who talked about here's issues for everybody to have, including oldish romance that was part of her personal story. We've had a number of those things come up, including in this book. And there was an interesting twist on this in that I've seen it described as a May-December romance, but I don't see it that way. I see it more like May-September maybe, because the person in question, the romancee, so to speak. I'm trying not to do spoilers here, but probably doesn't really matter. Anybody who picks up the book, there's probably a blurb on the cover of the book that describes what's going on. But up until a certain point, this character, Jim Bates, was in my mind the embodiment of Red Green in a different environment. I don't know whether you two know who Red Green is, but there's a Canadian comedy show that ran for many, many years, 200 and some odd episodes, called The Red Green Show. And Red Green was a character, and it was a kind of a skit show and a recurring skit. Every single week or every single show, there was a section where it was the handyman corner, where Red Green would take an old beat-up car and make a helicopter using duct tape and old parts from washing machines and stuff, and it would always work. And at the end of it, he would always say, if she doesn't find you handsome, she better find you handy. And that's how I thought about Jim Bates all the way through this. He was a handyman. He showed up. He knew what to do with raccoons. He showed up. He knew how to plow out the thing. He knew how to fix the window, all of that stuff. And in the end, she did find him handsome. So, and handy. He was handsome and handy. It wasn't like she was 60 and he was 20. He was in his mid to late 40s, so he wasn't like a baby. But so there was a bit of May-Decemberishness to it, and there was some hesitation on her part or in society's part about, was she too old for him and that sort of thing. But he never seemed to feel that way in particular. And she didn't really either, which mostly is what counts. So there was a blossoming romance through all of this. She was learning gardening and the forest paths, and through all of this, there was this blossoming romance in the background, and then which neither one of them was acknowledging until all of a sudden there it was, because of a snowstorm, I think.
What do you mean when you say May to December? I don't understand that phrase.
Well, there's an age disparity. So May-December romance is an older person and a younger person in a romance together.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so she was somewhat older than he was, not hugely older than, but it would have looked a whole lot different if the book was, she was 40 and he was 25. That would have been a whole different picture.
Right.
But as she was 60, a young 60, she was walking for miles and miles through the woods, taking pictures and wandering around, and she was all trim and fit. So she was a young 60 physically, but he was 46.
Yeah, they were really good for each other, too, in terms of friends. I mean, they started out as friends, and I think that they were both trying to figure out things in their lives. They both had difficult things they were trying to cope with, like his sister and that whole situation and her loss. They both had big losses, and the snowstorm was sort of the culmination of bringing them together in that they were coming to some kind of resolution and being able to cope with those losses, but they weren't there yet. But then I think that just pushed them together in a way that was very physically intimate because of the snowstorm, but also emotionally intimate because they had connection in terms of where they were in relationships and in their lives. And so it became romantic. And I like that it was a natural sort of spark. And it came from a
Literally.
neediness.
One of the things I appreciated about the writing of this relationship was how Rebecca, when she didn't hear from Jim after they had been intimate and she didn't hear from him, she assumed many things, that he didn't like her, that he was rude, that he, whatever it might be. And it took her a long time to find out that there'd been a crisis in his own family. And that's why he had not been able to reach back out to her. And it's a theme that's true for any age, but I think it's interesting, the theme of being curious as opposed to jumping to assumptions. But I think it's also interesting to think about what that means as an oldish person. She was feeling vulnerable already. She was feeling incompetent and just in this place of disequilibrium. And then this guy, she has this amazing experience and then doesn't see him again, doesn't hear from him again. And so I like that that was put in there too, just to a reminder of we don't really know until we check things out.
And of course, it was Sarah, right, that told her about it. Why she hadn't seen Jim for a while.
Yeah, but weeks later, that surprised me. Sarah talked about everybody all the time. And she went in to get some scones, and Sarah did not say, "Did you hear about Jim?" And so she was left in the dark by that. I don't know if that would have happened in real life, but the story required that she stew on that for a little bit. So, but it seemed out of character for both of them, that Sarah and Rebecca, that it didn't come up.
Yes, well, that's plot, right? It's plot. It was part of the plot, you know. It's like, it made me think of a Shakespearean play when this happens and that happens and nobody knows what happened, and then at the end it all comes together, right?
So there was a plot. This isn't real life.
Yeah, it was a story. It was a plot, and it was actually. I thought it was very well played. It was very well played, you know, because it had to happen like that, right, in the plot to happen. You're right. It was uncharacteristic.
I know that our time is running short, and this has been a lively conversation. And I know we could keep on going about still life with breadcrumbs. But Greg, you said you had something you wanted to share before we completely end.
Yeah, there were a number of turns of phrase, and I'm not good at taking notes, but there was one that struck me as being quintessentially oldish. Here's the narrator talking about Rebecca. Then when she really thought about it, she realized that she'd been becoming different people for as long as she could remember, but had never really noticed or had put it down to moods or marriage or motherhood. So in the quiet of her oldishness and her retreat, she was able to recognize this pattern in herself. And it's a pattern that we all share, I think, because we're all constantly becoming different people. Every minute that goes by, we're different from the person that we were a minute ago. Here's a segue for you. I'm always different after our book club sessions than I was before the book club sessions. Always different. I've learned more. I've had more laughter in my life. I've had more wisdom in my life. So I'm always different. And so that sentence really encapsulates the universality of that experience of realizing at some point, if you're lucky, realizing at some point that your whole life has been a becoming, not a solid isness, not a solid I am this. It's a becoming.
Just have to throw in Michelle Obama and her book, Becoming.
Aren't we all?
Anyway.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes. I think that everybody that listens to us will get a lot out of reading this book. It's funny at the end of our book club sessions, I don't think we've ever formally stated a recommendation, but I formally recommend this book. I really enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed the characters, and the next book I tried to read, the character development wasn't anywhere near as much fun. I didn't like hanging out with those people at all. So I stopped reading it. So I highly recommend this book. I highly recommend our Oldish Book Club. So for those of you who are listening to this for the first time, go back and listen to some of the other Oldish Book Clubs and get to know how we talk about books a little bit. I really have enjoyed this session today. There was a lot of laughter and a lot of learning of things, and it's always fun to hang out with you guys. So thank you.
And thank you, Leslie, in particular for guiding us around the author and the history and the synopsis. That's very much appreciated. I agree, Greg. This has been lovely. So we will do this again, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye, Leslie. Thank you. Bye, Janet. Thank you. Bye-bye. That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed reading and discussing Still Life with Breadcrumbs by Anna Quindlen. We hope you enjoyed listening. You can find a link to this and other books by Anna Quindlen in the show notes and on our website, www.oldish.me. Our next conversation will be with Dr. Gloria Horsley and Dr. Frank Powers, who met on an online dating site in their 80s, fell in love, and wrote a book together about the experience, Open to Love, The Secrets of Senior Dating. What could be more oldish than that? You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. There's a link there, too, if you've wondered how you can help support our podcast. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.